The day my parents kicked me out with a suitcase was the day the lottery hit. By dawn, I was rich. I'm Cindy Crawford. No, not the supermodel. Just a 34-year-old woman who once believed that loyalty, quiet perseverance, and talent would eventually be enough. I was wrong. I've learned that in some families. The more you try to prove your worth, the more invisible you become. The day my parents kicked me out with a suitcase and no plan. I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I didn't know that 12 hours later, the universe would answer with something that looked a lot like divine timing, except it wasn't magic, it was clarity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At the time, I was living in my childhood home just outside Houston, Texas. It wasn't my plan, not exactly. I had moved back in after my divorce to save money and stabilize myself while building a small interior design business on the side. My parents saw it differently. To them, I was starting over, which was code for you failed. They never said it out loud, of course, but it lived in their tone, their eyes, the subtle comments at dinner. Brianna just got promoted again, Mom would say. Her fork paused in midair, waiting for a reaction. Brianna was my older sister, a bank executive, the golden child who had never colored outside the lines. She had a mortgage, a husband, 3 kids in private school, and the unwavering approval of our parents. I had a Pinterest board, unpaid invoices, and a room full of paint samples. My dad, Howard, a retired accountant, still wore tucked-in polos and managed the family budget like it was a Fortune 500 company. My mom, Linda, was a retired high school teacher who could make you feel 10 years old with a single raised eyebrow. They were good people, decent even, but they believed in one path to success: security, conformity, obedience, and I had never quite fit. I worked part-time at a boutique downtown doing visual merchandising, which barely covered my car insurance, but I poured the rest of my energy into client mock-ups, mood boards, and social media marketing for my design services. I wasn't failing. I was building slowly, quietly, the kind of slow burn only someone truly obsessed with their craft would recognize. But to my parents, if you didn't have a W-2 or a manager, you were unemployed. Things came to a head the week of my 34th birthday. I'd been offered a chance to design a pop-up space for a new independent fashion label in Austin. It wasn't paid well, but the exposure was huge. The influencer behind the brand had 800,000 followers and had promised to tag the designer. It was the kind of portfolio piece that could open doors I'd only dreamed of when I brought it up at dinner. My mom barely looked up from her plate. Sounds cute. Cindy, but wouldn't it be better to get something stable before you chase these little projects? My dad chimed in. You know, Brianna's company is hiring, entry level, but with benefits. You could move out by summer. I felt the weight of the room press down on me. I tried explaining what the opportunity meant, how one good project could shift my entire client base. I showed them the brand's account, the design brief, the mood boards. My mother pursed her lips. You spend so much time online. Cindy, I worry that you're losing touch with reality. That's what they called my dream, a disconnect from reality. That night, I stayed up sketching. It was a habit I'd picked up since college, processing pain through color and shape. I created a layout for the pop-up, mapped out lighting, texture zones, product flow. Around 1 a.m., I got a text from Jordan, my old coworker and one of the few people who truly saw me. Happy early birthday. See, I still play your numbers every week. If we win, we disappear and start a design commune. Promise. He had this tradition. Every Thursday, he'd buy a joint lottery ticket with the numbers we picked together during one of our worst work weeks ever. It was a joke, 1 part hope, 3 parts exhaustion. I replied with a laughing emoji and a sleepy deal. The next morning, the storm came. Not the literal kind, though. Clouds did gather over Houston like something was about to snap, but the emotional one. I had missed a family brunch that I hadn't confirmed attending. My mom accused me of being disrespectful. My dad said I was taking advantage of their generosity. And Brianna, visiting for the weekend, stood silent while I tried to defend myself. I didn't ask to live here forever. I said calmly, I'm working. I have a business. I just need time. You've had time. My father snapped, what you need is a real job and accountability. My mom stepped in with her favorite phrase, it's not personal. Cindy, we just want what's best for you. Then came the sentence I'll never forget. Maybe it's time for you to figure that out somewhere else. It was 6:17 p.m. when I packed the first of 2 suitcases. I left behind 3 design projects, my drafting table, and a childhood bed that still had glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. My dad didn't offer to help. My mom watched me go, arms crossed, as if she were doing something noble by enforcing tough love. Brianna opened the door. That was the extent of her contribution. I got in my car, parked at the end of the block, and drove without knowing where I was going. I ended up at a roadside motel I'd passed 100 times on the way to downtown. The neon sign flickered, vacancy. I paid for 1 night with my last $78 and texted Jordan. Long story. I'm out. He replied 2 minutes later. Check the app. I didn't understand what he meant until he sent a screenshot. I stared at the message. Powerball winning numbers 3, 14, 22, 36, 41, 58. They were our numbers, every single one. And that was the moment I realized that everything they thought they had taken from me, stability, certainty, home had been replaced by something far more powerful, a clean slate, a second chance. By dawn, I wasn't just free, I was rich. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay on the motel bed, staring at the cracked ceiling with the cheap overhead light humming faintly, the silence broken only by the occasional thump of footsteps in the hallway outside. My brain couldn't process what had happened. The numbers matched. The ticket in my glove box, the one Jordan had joked about just hours earlier, wasn't a fantasy. It was real. I must have checked the lottery app 20 times between 1 a.m. and sunrise, as if the numbers might suddenly change, or someone would text and say, just kidding. But no one did. No one knew except Jordan. I didn't feel lucky. I felt disoriented, like someone had slammed a door on one version of my life and opened another one I hadn't even dared to imagine. By 6 a.m., I was dressed in the same jeans and sweater I'd worn the day before, sitting at a diner across from the motel with a mug of burnt coffee clutched between my hands. The waitress kept refilling it without asking. Probably because I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had been thrown out of her own life. I didn't touch the food. I just sat there, dazed, until my phone buzzed and Jordan's name appeared on the screen. I answered without saying hello and just whispered, "It's real." There was silence, then his voice, steady and low. "Okay, you're not going to panic. You're not going to tell anyone else. You're going to sign that ticket immediately, full name, and then we're calling a lawyer, a good one." He sent me the contact for Mason Keller, a private financial attorney in Austin, known for handling high-profile clients quietly. Jordan was already on his way from Austin and met me in the parking lot of the diner less than 2 hours later. The hug we shared wasn't joyful, it was grounding, a moment between two people who knew what it meant to hold on to your sanity in the face of something too big to comprehend. Mason's office looked like any other small firm, unassuming and quiet, the kind of place where people don't gossip. He walked us through every step. Yes, I had to go to the lottery office, But no, my name didn't have to be public. He set up a blind trust, explained how to receive the money in installments, and arranged for me to collect it without ever appearing on a winner's list. It felt more like filing taxes than claiming life-altering money, which was somehow reassuring. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, secure phone calls, and financial logistics. The money didn't all come at once, but a substantial portion hit a holding account within a week. I had access to just over $4.8 million. I was no longer broke. I was no longer dependent. I was no longer afraid of picking up the phone and hearing my mother's voice asking if I'd applied to the position at Brianna's company. And yet, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet, careful, hyper-aware that this freedom was rare and fragile, and if I wasn't deliberate, I could lose it before I ever made it count. I rented a temporary apartment in downtown Houston, one of those short-term furnished units people use when they're in between divorces or corporate relocations. It was clean, neutral, and safe. No one asked questions. I didn't tell the front desk my real name. I didn't change my phone number yet. I wasn't hiding. I just needed time to think without interruption. On my first night in the new place, I sat by the window looking down at the traffic, still wearing the same jeans and sweater, and made a list. It was the first list I'd written just for myself in years. 1. Find a permanent space that feels like mine. 2. Rebuild my business on my own terms. 3. Hire Jordan full-time with a salary that reflected his value. 4. Stop trying to earn respect from people who only know how to measure it in titles, salaries, and LinkedIn updates. That last one stung. I wasn't angry at my parents yet. I was too numb for anger. What I felt was a kind of aching distance, like the world I had been trying to belong to for decades had quietly shut its doors while I wasn't looking. By the end of that first week, Jordan and I started scouting properties in Austin. We found a former textile warehouse tucked in an arts district, a space with exposed brick, industrial windows, and the kind of raw beauty that most people couldn't see past. I saw everything. I saw my showroom, my workspace, my future. I bought it under a new LLC. No loan needed. It felt both surreal and completely rational, like I was finally doing what I was always meant to do, just without the begging, the budgeting, the endless compromises. We called it Crafted by Crawford, not because I wanted to put my name everywhere, but because for the first time, that name stood for something I had built myself. I hired a team of freelancers who had been overlooked like I had, a carpenter who had dropped out of architecture school to care for his mother, a designer who had been pushed out of a retail chain after taking maternity leave, a part-time photographer who had been told he was too experimental to shoot for catalogs. We worked late, played music while sanding floors, made mood boards over takeout, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself. Meanwhile, the silence from my family stretched. My phone buzzed with a text from Brianna. "Mom says you've gone off the grid. Everything okay?" I didn't reply. I wanted to, but I knew that once I opened that door, I'd be expected to explain what I had no interest in justifying. The worst part wasn't that they kicked me out. It was how easy it had been for them. No guilt, no second thoughts, no questions about whether I had a place to sleep or money to eat. They assumed I'd either come crawling back or that I'd finally accept the life they had mapped out for me. Instead, I disappeared, and something about that silence clearly unsettled them. A week later, my mother sent a message. "We heard some things. Call us when you can." I stared at the screen for a long time. They had heard whispers, maybe, that I was in Austin, that a new design firm had launched with surprising speed and polish, that my work was being shared by names with blue check marks. I had stayed anonymous publicly, but small industries talk. Someone somewhere had made the connection, but even then, even when my success had started to speak for itself, the message from my mother didn't contain a single apology, not even a hint of regret, just concern cloaked in control. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I needed to protect myself. I wasn't ready to hear their voices layered in passive judgment and backhanded concern. I wasn't ready to listen to questions disguised as advice. I wasn't going to hand them my piece and ask them to please not tear it apart. Because for the first time in my adult life, I didn't need their approval. I had outgrown it. 3 weeks after I moved into the temporary apartment in Houston and quietly purchased the Austin studio, Crafted by Crawford was already taking shape. Jordan had settled into the logistics side like he was born for it, coordinating permits, sourcing materials, and building our freelancer network with the precision of someone who knew what it was like to be underpaid, overlooked, and underestimated. We didn't throw money around. We built carefully, strategically, choosing long-term sustainability over instant flash. I spent long nights sketching out showroom layouts, refining mood boards, testing color palettes under real lighting instead of Photoshop filters. I wasn't chasing a trend. I was building an identity, the kind that couldn't be taken away because it didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Every decision I made was intentional. The logo was hand-drawn. The tagline design that feels like memory came from a line Jordan had said one night while staring at reclaimed wood panels we planned to use for the front desk. We weren't just selling aesthetics. We were offering a form of emotional connection people didn't know they craved until they stepped into our space. And yet, in the middle of this quiet storm of productivity, I still hadn't told a single person in my family the truth. My sister kept sending one-line messages every few days. Mom says hi. Dad asked if you were still mad. You're coming home for Sunday dinner. Right. Each one landed like a stone on my chest, not because I missed them, but because it was so clear they didn't even understand what had happened. They still thought I was being dramatic. They thought I was punishing them with silence. They didn't understand that silence wasn't punishment. It was protection. One Thursday morning, I sat in the corner booth of a cafe in East Austin, sipping black coffee and scrolling through interior design inquiries on our newly launched website. An email caught my eye. The sender was Olivia Blake, an influencer known for her capsule wardrobe line and brutal honesty about the fashion industry. She wrote, "Saw a photo of your pop-up layout for the Rhodes Collective, subtle, textured, beautifully sad. Are you available for a private showroom consultation?" My hands froze. That pop-up design had never been credited to me. I had been ghosted by the Rhodes team after I submitted my final mock-up last year. It was my biggest heartbreak before all of this began. My name wasn't anywhere on the photos Olivia must have seen, but she had recognized my touch. That shook me more than winning the lottery. Recognition without context, talent seen without needing a resume. I replied yes, gave her Jordan's number, and texted him to expect her call. By Friday afternoon, we had booked the consultation and closed our first celebrity client. Olivia arrived the following Tuesday with her stylist and brand manager. She walked through the unfinished showroom like she was absorbing something spiritual. "You don't design spaces," she said. "You build narratives." That sentence stuck with me. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. She wasn't congratulating me. She was meeting me on equal ground. By the end of the meeting, she commissioned a custom installation for her next capsule launch. Not a rental, not a collaboration. Full purchase, $74,000, paid in advance. That was the moment I knew Crafted by Crawford wasn't just viable, it was inevitable. Jordan and I didn't celebrate with champagne or photos. We didn't post about it. We went back to work, quietly, with purpose. The more people asked, "Who's behind this?" the more powerful our silence became. Because the truth is, when you've been erased before, you learn to value your privacy more than your spotlight. I wasn't hiding. I just no longer needed to be seen to know I was real. A week later, I walked into a local supply store to pick up custom lighting samples and ran into Nina. She had been one of my colleagues back when I worked visual merchandising at that boutique downtown. Back then. She'd smiled to my face, asked for collaboration ideas, then pitched them as her own in meetings. I had known, but never said anything. I was too focused on keeping my hours, staying polite, staying employable, seeing her now. I braced for something smug, but instead, her face froze. "Cindy," she said, clearly unsure whether to fake warmth or keep walking. I nodded. "How are you?" she asked, eyes scanning my outfit, my posture, my samples. I could feel her brain working, trying to place me in her mental file cabinet. The problem was, I no longer fit any drawer she had built. "I'm good," I replied, "running a design firm in East Austin now. I didn't offer more. I didn't need to." She blinked. "Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea. I thought you moved back in with your parents or something." The sentence came out before she could mask the judgment behind it. I smiled gently. "That was temporary. Things change." Then I paid for my samples and walked out. That evening, Jordan sent me a screenshot from a private design forum. Someone had posted, "Does anyone know who designed Olivia Blake's new showroom? Whoever it is, they're not tagging themselves. But the work is stunning." The comment section was buzzing. Some guesses, a few close ones. No one had it right. That anonymity was delicious, because the people who once dismissed me couldn't figure out how I'd slipped past them, how someone like me, quiet, unfunded, unconnected, could rise without their permission. The next day, I received another message from my sister. "Mom's asking again if you're coming to dinner this weekend. She's worried. Still no apology, still no acknowledgement, just an endless reach disguised as concern." I didn't answer. Because I had come to a quiet conclusion, I didn't owe the people who doubted me a front row seat to my becoming. They weren't entitled to witness what they once tried to stop. I wasn't angry. I wasn't waiting for them to understand. I had simply moved on, and every quiet step I took away from their version of who I was supposed to be felt like walking toward sunlight after years of living in a windowless room. The week after Olivia Blake's project was confirmed, everything started to shift quietly, but undeniably, there wasn't a single defining moment where I thought, "I've made it." No applause, no ribbon cutting, no viral post, just small confirmations that the things I once did in secret, with borrowed tools and secondhand materials, now held real value in the market and, more importantly, in my own eyes, we were still working out of what most people would call a construction site, with sawdust on the floor and the sound of drills echoing in the background. But emails were coming in daily. Independent brands, boutique hotels, one sustainable furniture line asking if I'd consult on their upcoming showroom in Marfa. They all had one thing in common. They found us, not through ads or industry connections, but because someone had whispered, "Check this place out." That whisper meant more to me than a billboard ever could. It was earned, not bought. Jordan started handling incoming inquiries while I focused on the creative side. It was the perfect rhythm. He had a way of making people feel safe in their choices, guiding them through contracts and timelines like a calm storm anchor. One morning, As I was reviewing stone samples for a custom countertop design, he slid me a file. "Take a look at this one," he said casually, though the look in his eyes told me it wasn't just another email. I opened the folder. Inside was a message from a production studio representing a streaming platform. They were looking for someone to design the interior of a set for a new docuseries on creative women entrepreneurs. They didn't want a celebrity designer. They wanted someone raw, sophisticated, emotionally resonant. They had seen photos of Olivia's showroom and tracked down the studio. They were asking for a meeting. I remember staring at the screen, blinking slowly. It wasn't just that the opportunity was enormous. It was that the brief described me more accurately than anyone in my family ever had. Later that night, I sat on the floor of the studio with Jordan, surrounded by concept boards and half-eaten tacos, and I said something I hadn't said out loud before. "Do you realize everything they mocked me for? Everything they called foolish or unrealistic or unstable? Those are the exact things making me money now." He nodded without looking up. That's how it usually works. The things they dismiss become your edge. He was right. For years, I had been told to let go of the artsy phase, to focus on practical careers, to stop wasting time on handmade details. My sketches were called doodles. My mock-ups were cute, but not serious. My weekend craft fair sales were treated like garage sale flukes. And yet, those very things, my eye for layering texture, my instinct for space, my ability to make people feel something when they entered a room, had become the foundation of my business. The quiet truth was that I had been right about myself the whole time. I just hadn't been allowed to believe it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me sharper. It made me listen more carefully to my own instincts. It made me trust the friction. Every time something felt uncomfortable but honest, I followed it. I started redesigning our brand language to better reflect our voice raw, intentional, emotionally grounded. I hired a writer to help us craft stories behind every piece we created, not just what it looked like, but what it meant, because we weren't just selling furniture layouts or color schemes. We were selling memory, presence, a sense of self inside four walls. It wasn't abstract, it was real, and people were responding to it. A few days later, I got another message, this one from an old friend I hadn't spoken to since college. She had seen a tagged photo on Olivia Blake's story and asked, "Is this your work? It looks like something you used to talk about in dorm rooms while everyone else was studying finance." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Yes, it's mine." She responded with a single word. "Finally." That word hit me in a strange place, not because it implied I'd been late to succeed, but because it suggested that I had always been headed here, that even people I thought had forgotten me remembered the direction I once pointed toward. It was bittersweet, because while I was finally becoming visible to people who had once ignored me, I still hadn't said a word to my family. My mother had stopped texting. My father hadn't called. My sister had gone quiet after a short passive-aggressive message about how hard it must be to juggle all that freelance stuff. It was clear they were confused, maybe even frustrated that I wasn't coming back to their version of normal. They probably still thought I was being difficult, or worse, prideful. The truth was, I wasn't avoiding them because of money or success. I was avoiding them because I no longer trusted their version of concern. I didn't want to hear another speech about what's best for you from people who had never once asked what I actually wanted. I didn't want to sit at a dinner table and explain why I preferred handcrafted clay finishes over store-bought tile. I didn't want to defend the fact that I paid freelancers more than the industry minimum because I remembered what it felt like to survive on coffee and free internships. I didn't want to translate my joy into a language they refused to learn, so I stayed silent. But silence isn't the same as peace. One night, I was at the studio late, organizing swatches and testing accent lighting, when I found a small velvet pouch tucked in the back of a drawer. It was from a client's materials shipment, but it reminded me of the drawstring bags I used to make jewelry in when I was 16, back then. I would sit cross-legged on the floor, using borrowed tools, listening to my mother sigh whenever she walked past. She thought I'd grow out of it. She thought it was a phase. She never saw the concentration, the hunger, the spark. Holding that pouch, I realized something painful. I had never really stopped being that girl. I had just spent years hiding her under a mask of professionalism and composure. But now, for the first time, she had space to breathe, to lead, to win. I took the pouch home and placed it on my desk as a reminder. That foolish girl, she's the reason I'm here. The invitation came in an email that arrived just after midnight, as if it had been sent in a moment of guilt or impulse. The subject line read, Sunday dinner. The sender was my mother. The message was short. We'd love to see you. Things got messy, and maybe we didn't handle it well. Let's talk. Just dinner. No lectures. Bring Jordan if you want. For a moment. I just stared at it. I had read it 3 times before I felt anything. Not anger, not relief, just a dull ache in the chest, like a bruise that didn't know it was still tender. I didn't reply right away. I left it there, unread in the technical sense, letting it exist in limbo like so many of our old conversations that never really resolved. The truth was, they were starting to feel the silence. Not just hear it, but feel it in their routines, their assumptions, their image of me. In their minds, I was still the daughter in limbo, the one who couldn't quite figure it out, who would eventually come home and settle down after this phase passed. But the version of me they remembered no longer existed. I had moved into a new season of life, and I didn't leave a forwarding address. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. I can come Sunday. Jordan won't join. Thank you. I didn't say I forgave them. I didn't pretend everything was fine. I just showed up. Because sometimes silence only works if you're willing to break it with presence, not words. That Sunday, I drove back to my parents' house for the first time since the night I left with a suitcase and no plan. The street looked the same, but I didn't. I parked on the curb like a visitor, not a returning child. Brianna's SUV was already in the driveway. I took a deep breath, walked up the porch, and rang the doorbell. My mother opened it like she had been standing behind the door waiting. Her expression softened when she saw me, but she didn't step forward to hug me. That told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sure who I was anymore. Dinner was polite. My father made small talk about neighborhood changes and a new grocery store opening near the freeway. My mother asked how I liked Austin. Brianna scrolled on her phone until my mother glared at her. No one mentioned money. No one asked if I was working. No one asked if I needed anything. The entire evening was built like a house with no furniture hollow. Careful, not quite warm, but it was peaceful, and that was new. After dinner, as we stood in the kitchen scraping plates, my mother finally said it. We were too harsh. You didn't deserve to be pushed out like that. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to reward her for barely reaching the starting line of self-awareness, but I appreciated the effort. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Back in Austin, I returned to the studio with a sharper sense of who I was building this for. Not them, not the clients, not the critics. I was building it for the version of me that had always whispered, "There's more than this." I poured that energy into our next big commission, a sensory therapy space for a mental health startup that catered to creative professionals. They didn't want white walls and fake plants. They wanted raw textures, shifting light, imperfect edges. They wanted real, and that was all I had ever offered. One afternoon, while laying out tile samples for the project, Jordan said quietly, "Your mom texted me last night. She said thank you." I looked up. "For what?" He shrugged. "She didn't say, just said thank you." I didn't ask to see the message. I just nodded and went back to work. Some things aren't meant to be interpreted. They're just meant to exist, like the faint smell of sawdust after a long day. Lingering proof that something was built from nothing. Then came the press. A local arts journalist reached out after attending a private showing of Olivia's new line. She had traced the showroom design back to us and wanted to feature Crafted by Crawford in their Makers of the City series. I didn't want the spotlight, but Jordan, ever the strategist, convinced me, if people are going to talk, let them talk about the work, not the rumor. We gave them a tour, answered carefully chosen questions, and focused on process over personality. The article ran under the headline, "The Studio That Feels Like Home Before You Even Move In." It was thoughtful, respectful, and it lit a fuse. By the following week, our inbox tripled in volume. Designers, stylists, boutique owners, even 2 hotel managers from out of state wanted to know if we consulted. Suddenly, the work I had been told wasn't serious enough for a real career was now being sought out by companies willing to fly me across the country for a single walkthrough. Jordan and I built a waiting list. We were booked for 6 months straight. I hired 2 more team members, both women in their late 30s who had been quietly pushed out of their previous jobs after taking maternity leave. They were talented, determined, and grateful to be seen for what they brought to the table. We didn't just build a business. We built a place where overlooked talent came to prove everyone wrong, gently and without apology. The following month, I got a message from Brianna. She had seen the article. She kept it short, impressive. I mean that. I appreciated the effort, but it also reminded me how much space there still was between us. Because when someone has spent years framing your ambition as instability, it takes more than admiration to rebuild trust. It takes presence. It takes reflection. And sometimes it takes time apart. The next time my mother called, I let it ring twice before answering. She asked how I was. I said good. She asked about the studio. I gave her one-word answers. Then she asked, "Do you think you'll ever come back home?" I paused. "I am home," I said quietly, and I meant it, because home isn't a location. It's the place where you're allowed to grow without apology. That night, I sat alone in the studio after everyone else had gone. The lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow, the kind of tone that made the plaster walls feel like warm clay. I walked from room to room, touching each texture, each surface, each design element we had curated. I saw myself in every choice, in the reclaimed oak beams, in the hand-poured tile, in the imperfect but intentional lines of every table and chair. This space didn't exist when they told me to stop chasing dreams. This space wasn't funded by their approval. It wasn't built to impress them or convince them of my worth. It was built in the silence they left behind, and that made it real in a way nothing else ever had. It was a Thursday afternoon when the past finally walked through the front door, not metaphorically, but in the form of Darren. He had been the man I once thought I would marry. We had dated in my late 20s when I still worked weekends, believed in titles, and thought that blending into someone else's life counted as progress. He liked the version of me that made life easier for him, supportive, quiet, talented, but not too ambitious. He ended things the day I showed him my plan to launch a small interior design studio, said it sounded risky, said I wasn't thinking realistically, said, no offense, but you're not one of those women who makes it big. I remembered every word because they didn't hurt in the way heartbreak does. They hurt the way disrespect does, sharp, sudden, final. So seeing him now, unannounced and standing in the entrance of Crafted by Crawford, was surreal. He looked around the space with something between awe and confusion, like he had walked into a dream that somehow belonged to me but didn't make sense to him. I stood at the front desk, calm, collected, letting him feel the full weight of the silence. He was the first to speak. I saw the article. I wasn't sure it was you until I saw the photo of the tile work. You always had that thing for contrast. He chuckled like we were sharing an inside joke. I didn't laugh. I just nodded and waited. He glanced at the walls, the exposed beams, the team meeting happening in the back corner, then back at me. This place, it's incredible. I mean, I didn't know you were doing all this. When did it even happen? I kept my voice steady. After you said it wouldn't. He winced, just barely, and then smiled like someone trying to cover a burn. Look, I was wrong. I can admit that now. This is clearly more than I expected. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because he wasn't here to apologize. He was here to measure me, to reconcile the girl he left with the woman standing in front of him now, who didn't need him, didn't wait for him, didn't even offer him a chair. He finally asked, "Are you happy?" I paused, not to dramatize the moment, but to give it the respect it deserved. "I'm free," I said, "and I built something that reflects who I really am. So yes, that's happiness to me." He nodded slowly. "Well, if you ever want to catch up properly, maybe dinner sometime. I'd love to hear more about what you're working on." I offered a professional smile. "We're fully booked for the next 8 months. If you're interested in becoming a client, you can submit an inquiry through the website." And with that, I turned back to my desk, letting the conversation end where it needed to. He left soon after, and I didn't look back to see if he did. That evening, I stayed at the studio late, not to work, but to sit with the moment. It wasn't anger that filled me. It wasn't triumph either. It was peace, a quiet kind of power that doesn't need recognition to feel real, the kind that builds slowly, over time, without needing to announce itself. It just exists. Darren wasn't the only ghost that reappeared. Over the next few weeks, former colleagues, old acquaintances, even extended family members started reaching out. They had seen the articles, the photos, the brand mentions. Most acted surprised, some curious, others subtle in their envy. There was a pattern to their messages, thinly veiled compliments, awkward admiration, polite requests to reconnect, but none of them asked what it had cost me to get here. None of them apologized for the years I spent second-guessing myself because of their voices in my head. And that was fine, because I no longer needed their understanding. I had my own. Jordan noticed it too. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts with a new boutique hotel chain, he looked up and said, "You've changed. Not in a bad way. Just, you don't flinch anymore when people doubt you." I smiled, surprised by how true that felt. Maybe because I stopped mistaking their doubt for truth. That sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. I had learned to build without applause, to believe without backup. And now that everything was working, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sovereign. There's a difference. Vindication needs someone to witness your comeback. Sovereignty means you don't care who's watching. Around this time, I made a decision I had been considering quietly for months. I wanted to create a mentorship fund, not a scholarship, not a charity, a fund to support women in design who had been dismissed or derailed women like me, not based on grades or prestige, but on potential. I called it the Quiet Start. It would offer grants, studio space, and paid apprenticeships for women who were rebuilding, restarting, or simply trying to be heard. I funded it with a portion of my lottery winnings, quietly, through a separate entity that didn't link directly back to me. I didn't want credit. I wanted ripple effects. When we announced the program's launch through a modest press release, applications flooded in. Some of the essays broke me open. Women who had been laid off during maternity leave, women who had supported their siblings through school and put their own careers on hold. Women who had been told, in boardrooms and bedrooms, that they weren't quite enough. We selected 5 for the first round, when I met them for the first time. Standing in the same room where I once cried alone over paint samples and rejection emails, I didn't offer a speech. I just said, "This place exists because no one gave me permission. Neither should you wait for it." That evening, my mother called. Her voice was hesitant, but softer than I remembered. "I read about your mentorship program." She said, "It's generous." I said, "Thank you." She hesitated. "I think I understand a little more now, what you were trying to do all those years." I didn't ask what took her so long. I didn't ask if my father had read the article. I didn't ask for more. I just let her sit in that space, the way she once made me sit in silence at the dinner table after trying to defend my ideas. This was a different silence, not defensive, not punitive, just clear. After we hung up, I sat on the studio floor with a cup of tea and watched the light change through the high windows. The city hummed outside, but inside, everything was still. I thought about Darren, about my family, about the jobs I didn't get, the emails I never received replies to, the times I almost gave up. And then I thought about now, the space, the team, the fund, the freedom, and I realized something that I wish I could tell the version of me who once cried in a motel room with $68 in her account. You don't need to prove them wrong. You just need to prove yourself right. 3 months after launching the Quiet Start Fund, something happened that caught me off guard. My father reached out, not through a passive comment or a forwarded article. He called. I didn't pick up at first. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't sure if it would be another quiet probe masked as concern or a calculated attempt to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. But when I listened to the message, his voice was softer than I remembered. "Hi, Cindy. I was hoping we could talk. No pressure. Just, I think I'd like to see what you've built." That was it. No long speech. No list of regrets. Just a sentence that felt more honest than anything I'd heard from him in years. I didn't reply right away. I needed time to decide if I wanted to open that door again, even slightly, because while forgiveness can be noble, it should never be automatic, especially when the wound wasn't just personal, it was structural. It was years of being told what I wasn't enough. I ended up calling him back 2 days later. We set a time, Saturday afternoon. I told him where the studio was and warned him that it wasn't a showroom for browsing or a place to drop by unannounced. He said he understood when the day came. He arrived 5 minutes early, standing awkwardly near the entrance in slacks and a button-down like he was attending a job interview. I greeted him with a nod, not a hug. He looked around slowly, taking in the space, the exposed beams, the hand-finished tables, the soft hum of collaboration in the back rooms. He didn't say much at first, just observed. It was Jordan who broke the silence. walking by with a clipboard and offering a quiet, "Welcome. Let me know if you need anything." My father nodded, then turned to me. "This is impressive." I didn't respond. I let him feel the weight of it, because this wasn't for show. This wasn't a tour designed to earn his approval. This was my life, in progress, unapologetic and complete. We walked through the different rooms, and he asked simple questions. "Did you design this layout? How long did the build take? Who built those light fixtures?" He listened, really listened, and for once, he didn't correct, compare, or interrupt. When we reached the final room, where we were preparing a new installation for a gallery partnership, he stopped and looked at a corner piece made of layered wood and concrete. "This looks like something from your high school art projects," he said, almost smiling, except now it's finished. That line stung a little, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest, and maybe, unintentionally, it was also an apology. I didn't take the bait. I just said, "I've always liked raw materials. They remind me that beauty doesn't need to be perfect to be lasting." He nodded. "I didn't understand that before. I think I see it now." We sat down in the front lounge, and he asked about the fund. I explained how we selected applicants, how we supported them through mentorship and paid work. He nodded as I spoke, then said something that surprised me. "I think we underestimated how strong you really were, not because you weren't loud about it, but because you never asked us to validate it." I let that sit. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Finally, I replied, "I stopped asking because it was clear you had already decided who I was allowed to be." He looked down at his hands. "You're right. We did. Your mother and I. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment, but we were just protecting ourselves from having a daughter we didn't know how to understand." That admission hit harder than I expected, not because it erased the past, but because it finally acknowledged it without blame or excuses. After he left, I didn't cry. I didn't feel some cinematic release. What I felt was a quiet recognition that healing doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it walks in wearing dress shoes and asks respectful questions. Sometimes it just listens. A few days later, Brianna called. I debated whether to answer. She had always been the sister who did everything right. Honor roll, internship, promotion, mortgage. She didn't necessarily mean harm, but her entire presence had served as a comparison point my whole life. I picked up. Her tone was oddly casual. "Hey, Dad said he visited your studio. He wouldn't shut up about it at dinner. I think Mom's getting jealous." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was ridiculous that my mother could be jealous of something she once treated as a waste of time. Brianna continued, "So, listen, there's a women's leadership brunch next month. They're doing a panel on female founders. I told them about you. They want you to speak." I raised an eyebrow. "You told them about me?" She hesitated. "I didn't give details, just said you started something unique, and I think it would help people to hear your story." That moment was layered, part attempt at connection, part guilt offering, part recognition. I didn't give her an answer then. I said I'd think about it. Because even when people begin to shift, you still get to decide how close they're allowed to come. Over the next few weeks, the studio kept growing. We took on 3 new projects, signed a partnership with a local artist collective, and began developing a new furniture line sourced from reclaimed materials across Texas. I wasn't chasing expansion. I was building depth, and in the middle of all of it, I received a small package with no return address. Inside was a photo of me from high school, standing next to my first attempt at a full-scale display board for a local art fair. I had forgotten the photo existed. On the back, in neat handwriting I recognized instantly, were 4 words: "You were always enough." It wasn't signed, but I knew it came from my mother. I didn't call her. I didn't write back. I placed the photo on the shelf behind my desk, next to a sample from our first commission, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a marker, a quiet line between the version of me they used to know and the woman they were only just beginning to see. The day the city's design museum called was one I almost missed. I had been knee-deep in layout revisions for a restaurant remodel, elbows covered in pencil smudges, when Jordan walked into the studio, holding his phone with a look I hadn't seen before, not worry, not shock, something closer to restrained disbelief. "You need to take this," he said, handing it over. I wiped my hands and pressed the phone to my ear, and a calm voice introduced herself as the director of programming at the Contemporary Design Institute of Texas. She said she'd been following our work through industry chatter and private referrals. Then she said the thing I least expected to hear. "We're curating a new exhibition. It's called Shifting Foundations, and it focuses on creators whose work emerged from disruption rather than pedigree. We would like to feature you." I paused. I wasn't sure if she had the right person, but she continued with confidence, clearly knowing what she wanted. "We've reviewed your materials. Your story is compelling, but what's more important is how your spaces make people feel. This isn't about trends. It's about truth." And just like that, I was invited to create an original installation for a design institution that had, for years, only featured people with degrees from Parsons or RISD or decades of gallery-backed exposure. I hadn't sought them out. I hadn't pitched myself. They had found me because the work spoke without needing a resume. When I hung up, I didn't scream or jump up and down. I just sat down, hard, on the arm of the nearest chair and let it wash over me. All the times I had tried to convince former bosses or family members that I knew what I was doing. All the nights I stayed up perfecting textures that no one would notice but me. All the moments I almost gave up because the silence from the world felt like rejection. It had led here. Not because I chased validation, but because I stayed consistent when no one was clapping. Jordan poured 2 glasses of cold seltzer and clinked his with mine. "To the long road," he said, "and to not needing shortcuts." Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into the exhibit. The museum gave us creative freedom, a generous budget, and full access to their fabrication team. But I chose to keep the work in-house. I wanted it to come from our hands, our mess, our rhythm. The installation was called Unpermitted. It was an abstract space made of layered materials, unfinished wood, raw steel, softened fabric, broken tiles stitched with gold, inspired by the Japanese art of kintsugi. Each material represented a phase of rejection, doubt, risk, and transformation. No walls, just zones, no signage, just feeling. At the center was a bench made from my first design table, the one I had rescued from the garage before my father threw it out. We refinished it, but left a corner untouched. I wanted people to see the scratch marks, the burn where I once dropped a candle, the faded pencil sketch I had forgotten to sand down. I wanted them to know I didn't start with power tools or capital. I started with persistence. When we unveiled the space during a private preview, the reactions were quiet. People didn't speak right away. They walked through slowly, like they were moving through someone else's memory. One woman stood by the gold-stitched tile wall and whispered, "This reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen, but it also feels like a poem." That was the moment I knew it had landed. The exhibit launched to strong press and better word of mouth. We didn't get viral coverage. We got something better. We got respect. Thoughtful mentions in serious design journals. DMs from industry veterans who had never acknowledged us before. More importantly, we got new voices, emerging artists, displaced designers, underrepresented builders reaching out to say, "You made me feel like I could start again." That was the win, not the museum, not the press, not even the contracts that followed. It was the quiet validation from people who saw the story behind the polish and recognized themselves in it. Then one afternoon, just as I was wrapping a planning session with a client, I noticed a familiar car pull up outside the studio. My mother. She got out slowly, clutching a small envelope, and hesitated before coming to the door. I met her outside before she could knock. She held the envelope out and said softly, "I didn't know how else to say this. I didn't take it right away." I waited. She continued, "I saw the exhibit. I went during member preview night. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure I was allowed in that part of your life anymore." Her voice didn't tremble. It was calm, measured, honest, in a way I rarely heard from her. She handed me the envelope and looked me in the eye. "You were right. I didn't see you clearly before. That's my fault. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I'll earn it if I can." Inside the envelope was a photo of me at 8 years old, sitting on the floor surrounded by cardboard boxes I had turned into rooms with construction paper wallpaper and little pieces of string for curtains. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "You were already building homes long before we realized." I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just nodded. She nodded back. Then she walked to her car and drove away. No dramatic pause, no last look, just a clean, honest moment that felt like a step toward something new. That night, I placed the photo beside the old table-turned bench in our exhibit space. I didn't label it. I didn't frame it. I just let it be there, quietly, part of the story, because at some point, you realize success isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about no longer needing their permission to be right. The people who once silenced you may never apologize in the way you deserve. Some may show up late. Some may never arrive at all. But by the time they do, if you've done the work, you won't need them to validate your journey. You'll already know who you are. There was a moment, weeks after the exhibit had closed and the press cycle had quieted, where I found myself standing in the middle of my studio late at night. No music playing, no lights except for the soft amber glow spilling from the street lamps outside. Everyone had gone home. The tools were resting. The designs were paused. And for the first time in months, I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't building, fixing, preparing, or protecting. I was just breathing in that stillness. I realized something most people miss while chasing the next goal. Success isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet room that no longer drains you. Sometimes it's not having to rehearse your worth in your own head before entering a room. Sometimes it's not being afraid of silence because your own voice finally feels enough. That clarity didn't come from applause or press coverage or passive-aggressive praise from people who once overlooked me. It came from walking away, from the home I thought I had to preserve, from the family I thought I had to win back, from the version of myself that used to ask, "Is this okay?" before making every move. I didn't leave to punish them. I left to hear myself without the noise. And once I heard that voice clearly, I started following it relentlessly, imperfectly, but without apology. It took me years to understand that not everyone who questions you is trying to destroy you. Some people genuinely cannot see you beyond the limits they've assigned you in their head. For them, your growth is confusing, even offensive, because it challenges their memory of who they thought you were. I used to take that personally. I used to try and re-explain myself every time I sensed confusion or disapproval, hoping that the right words could make them understand. But eventually, I realized the truth. If someone needs your suffering to understand your success, they were never rooting for you in the first place. This shift affected how I chose my collaborators, my clients, even my friends. I no longer entertained passive support, the kind that says, "I'm happy for you," but withholds presence. I stopped inviting people into rooms where they only showed up to measure or compare instead. I started investing in people who showed up early, who stayed late, who asked, "What do you need?" without needing to be thanked. Jordan was one of those people. Our bond wasn't built on flattery or trauma bonding. It was built on rhythm, respect, shared silence that didn't need to be filled. One evening, as we finalized plans for a new artist co-op we were sponsoring, he said something that stayed with me. "You didn't just build a business. You built an ecosystem where people get to start again." I didn't respond right away. I just looked around at the team, 3 women who had been let go from corporate firms after maternity leave, a non-binary architect who had struggled to get licensed due to bureaucracy, 2 apprentices from the Quiet Start Fund who were now leading design segments of their own, and I nodded, because yes, this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about what came after survival. It was about designing spaces where others didn't have to beg to be taken seriously. Around that time, I got an email from a name I hadn't seen in years, my old manager at the firm where I was once an unpaid intern. The one who told me that my ideas were visually emotional and that emotion isn't strategy. He was now consulting for a chain of boutique hotels that wanted to incorporate more female-led design voices into their rebranding. His email was polished, respectful, almost flattering. He mentioned he'd followed my progress and was impressed by how far I'd come. Then came the ask. "We'd love to see if there's an opportunity to bring you in as a creative lead on this project." I didn't respond immediately. I let it sit, not because I was angry, but because I wanted to make sure I was answering from clarity, not ego. A few days later, I replied, short, precise, and without bitterness, "Thank you for reaching out. At this time, I'm not taking on external branding partnerships. Wishing you and your team the best." I didn't offer explanations. I didn't mention how I remembered every meeting where he interrupted me. I didn't need to. That was the victory, saying no without needing to prove why. One of the hardest things I've had to learn is that growth comes with a kind of grief. You don't just outgrow people. You outgrow roles, identities, versions of yourself that once felt like safety. You mourn the comfort of being underestimated, of flying under the radar, of being invisible enough to avoid conflict. But eventually, invisibility becomes suffocating, and when you finally choose visibility on your own terms, not for attention, but for alignment, you start to see the world rearrange around you. Not everyone will clap. Some will step back. Some will try to copy you. Some will try to write themselves into your story as if they were there all along. That's fine. Let them tell their version. You keep building yours. At the end of that month, I was invited to speak at a private summit for women who had started second careers after 30. I almost declined. I didn't see myself as a speaker. I saw myself as a builder. But when I arrived, I realized these women weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for truth. I spoke about the motel room, about the silence, about the day I walked away from my family not out of anger, but necessity, about building something that wasn't trying to fit into an industry, but rewriting what the industry could look like. Afterward, A woman in her 50s came up to me, eyes watery, but not weak. I thought I was too late. She said, "But you made me feel like I'm just getting started." I held her hand for a second longer than necessary, not because I had the answers, but because I knew what it felt like to need that one moment of human connection that says, "You're not crazy. You're just early." That's when I knew. I hadn't built a company. I had built proof. That quiet doesn't mean small. That healing doesn't mean hiding. That walking away isn't the end of a story. It's the start of a different kind of clarity. And most importantly, that you don't need to burn bridges to leave. Some you simply outgrow. Some crumble behind you without fire, because not every exit needs to be loud. Some are just a woman quietly choosing herself. The first time I saw my story quoted back to me by someone else, it was in a podcast. I hadn't been invited, hadn't submitted my journey as a case study, but there it was, a speaker discussing women who had rebuilt from zero, who had been discarded, dismissed, or underestimated and somehow turned that silence into structure. The host mentioned a design studio founded by a former intern who was once told she was too emotional for leadership. She didn't say my name, but I knew. I knew because I'd lived every syllable of that description. And I smiled, not because I needed credit, but because the narrative had become bigger than me. It had entered the cultural bloodstream. Quiet resilience was finally trending, and I had helped set the tone. That realization didn't inflate me. It grounded me, because the goal was never to be famous. It was to be free. And yet, somewhere along the way, people started watching, not the ones I had tried to impress a decade earlier, new ones, young women who had just gotten laid off without warning, mid-career professionals who were told they were too difficult or not strategic enough, people who had dreams with no blueprint, only instinct. They started messaging, showing up, sitting quietly at the edge of workshops just to see if there was still room for people like them in rooms like this. And every time I saw them, I remembered the version of me who once tried to make herself smaller so someone else could be comfortable. That woman deserved better. And now she had it. I was invited back to the Design Museum, not just for another exhibit, but to be a guest curator for their spring showcase. This time, they asked me to select the theme. I chose one word: redemption, not in the dramatic, headline-grabbing sense, but in the quiet, personal way that redemption happens when you reclaim your voice without demanding applause. We showcased work from artists who had returned to their craft after burnout, designers who had rebuilt after bankruptcy, photographers who had gone invisible after motherhood. Every corner of that exhibit whispered, "You still belong." It was the kind of space I had once needed and never found. So I built it, and watching others step into it, some nervously, some defiantly, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt useful. That same month, my brother called, the one who used to call me the arts and crafts phase. He asked if I would review the plans for his new house, said he trusted my eye. I laughed, not at him, but at the full circle. We set up a time. It wasn't awkward. It was adult, mutual. He didn't apologize for mocking my sketches years ago. He didn't need to. The request itself said everything. That's the thing no one tells you about healing. It doesn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it just shows up in changed behavior. My parents came to the spring showcase. They didn't ask for a private tour. They walked through like everyone else. My mother stopped at a piece called Return, a delicate installation built from shattered glass, stitched together with copper thread. She stood there for nearly 15 minutes. She didn't say much, just turned to me and said, "It's strange. I never thought broken could look strong." I nodded. That's because we were taught to hide the cracks. She blinked, quietly absorbing that. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she touched my shoulder and said, "Thank you for not staying angry." I didn't answer, not because I held resentment, but because some words are enough on their own. That night, back at the studio, I sat with Jordan, watching the city lights through the high windows. He poured us both a drink and said, "So what's next?" I thought about it for a while. There was no rush to expand, no hunger for the next headline. Instead, I said, "I want to build something that doesn't need me." He raised an eyebrow. I explained, "I want to create a structure that runs even when I'm resting, a team that leads when I'm not looking, a culture that protects itself from what we escaped." He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. That was the dream now. Sustainability, not the kind measured in profits, but in peace. A few weeks later, I was walking through a neighborhood I used to live in during the worst months of my rebuilding, back when I rented a room above a laundromat and heated tea with a plug-in coil. The building was still there, the windows cracked the same way, the door frame still leaning slightly left. I stood there, remembering the version of me who curled up on that thin mattress with headphones in, drowning out the shame of failure with playlists about possibility. I whispered thank you to her, not because she was strong, but because she stayed, because she kept showing up when no one else did. And finally, I understood the full circle. The lottery I won that night wasn't just numbers and cash. It was silence, space, the kind of distance that forced me to rebuild without anyone else's blueprint. I wasn't handed a legacy. I created one, and the most radical part, I did it without revenge, without begging anyone to notice, without rewriting history. I just lived into my truth so fully that the people who once doubted me had no choice but to recalibrate their assumptions. That's the real redemption arc, when your success becomes so undeniable. It rewrites the room you were once shut out of without you having to say a word. So if someone listening to this is still stuck in the quiet part of their story, still whispering dreams in between shifts or sketching ideas no one believes in, let this be your sign. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't need a spotlight to be valid. You just need to keep going. Even when no one claps, especially then, because one day the silence will break and you'll realize it wasn't punishment. It was preparation,